Okay, great. So, hello everyone. I've been introduced, so I don't need to introduce myself. That's great. If you have any questions and you want to ask them during the workshop, please just try to wait at the end of the slide. I don't really have the opportunity to look in the chat because Teams doesn't really allow that in a nice way when I'm sharing the screen. So I'll try to give you the opportunity to do so. And yeah, if you do have any questions, please let me know. I would love to elaborate. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? We're going to talk about Dutch politics. And basically, I'm going to try to make you understand this meme. And this is all very great because all I'm actually going to do is I'm going to try to explore the Dutch political landscape by just talking about all these political parties that we have here. And luckily, nothing really big happened. So this will be just a very easy, normal workshop that I can give. Not. So as you might have already heard, the Dutch cabinet fell once again. And that will be as basically how we will explore most of the parties. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through just first the basics, explain how does just the Dutch parliament work. Then I'm just going to go through a couple of parties. And when going through these couple of parties, I will also explain what the hot topic political issues are in the Netherlands and how the government has tried to resolve them or hasn't been really able to try to resolve them. So I want you to keep this line through the workshop because there is a lot of material that will basically come your way. And the way this often can be used in motions is quite different, but it basically means that you have a lot of like more examples to understand, how this would look like in different countries because the Dutch system is quite different than, for example, the UK or even just the US system. So if you have, for example, you're going to hear about different parties. And what I want you to keep in mind is kind of like just the role of small parties, but also the act of splitting off of parties within the Netherlands. Also, just what are the current political issues in the Netherlands? So, how do people view this? What do they think are important? How do they see the government's role in these issues? As well as basically how do coalitions work or not work in Dutch politics? So, why is this the case? Now, let's just start with the very basic structure of the Netherlands. So, the Netherlands has two chambers. This basically means that you have people that are elected that go in these chambers, and the second chamber is directly voted in. This is just the body that basically proposes policy, where you can make amendments and where you can directly just check the coalition and cabinet. So you can have a lot of checks and balances that are in place in this one. The first chamber is indirectly voted in. So you have provincial elections, and basically the result of those provincial elections then determine who goes into the first chamber. So in that sense, it's somewhat of a hybrid between having a direct representative democracy where you directly vote in your parliament, as well as having some of the constituencies because the provincial ones are more on these constituency-based votes. However, the first chamber doesn't really allow, doesn't really have the opportunity to propose any policy. It basically just checks whether policy can go or cannot go. Very, very rarely it says no, and oftentimes it's just because it's against the constitution or it is a very unclear law. What it can do is it can kind of like slow down policy by just asking for clarifications, telling people to do more stuff. But also, what they can do is they can look. There are potential some problems with the way you've explained what this means. Therefore, you need to pass like a new amendment or you need to make a change to be able to have this pass through. But oftentimes the first chamber is not that important. So the main focus will be on the second chamber. So what then happens? You basically in the Netherlands have a multi-party system, and I do truly mean a multi-party system. So you have a lot of parties. There are a couple of parties on this slide. These are not all the parties you can vote for, and I think this is in that sense still incomplete. The basic idea of the Netherlands is if you get basically enough votes to get one seat, you're all good. You don't have a system like you have in other countries where if you don't meet a certain threshold, like for example 5 seats, then you don't get a position in parliament. One seat is more than enough. And one example would be, for example, PvdA was a party that only had one seat when it was in power, or sorry, when it was in the parliament, and that's just fine and possible. But the fact that there are so many parties also means that coalitions are just needed. So in 2022 was the last time that we had one party be able to get the majority of the votes to be able to just rule by themselves. So coalition building is just a priority and like just a must within Dutch politics. Now, what does this mean? Well, we currently have a coalition, and the coalition that I'm going to talk about mostly are just going to be these parties. So we have a right-wing coalition. So these are right-wing parties. The ones that we're going to discuss are the VVD, the PVV, the BBB, and the NSC. These all have different, things that they stand for, and I hopefully will make clear what they are standing for and why they are important. And it's kind of like interesting to note that the Netherlands has had quite long history of just having having right-wing governments. So the last completely left-wing coalition that we had was in 1973 until 1977. And there have been somewhat more mixed coalitions, which means that you have a coalition with a right-wing party and left-wing parties. So, for example, in 1994 and 2002, as well as in 2012 and 2015. But the left really hasn't been in like a major power for quite a long time. So this is just some interesting context to note. We're relatively right-wing, even though most countries would see us as left-wing. Okay, so let's then start with the first political party to just talk about, the VVD. So as you can see here, this is a still somewhat incomplete political compass. The VVD is right-leaning, so it has right political ideas, as well as being somewhat conservative, but not very conservative. As you might know, this is Mark Rutte. He was the Prime Minister of the Netherlands for a long time. He's now head of NATO. And then we have Jezelgus, who is the currently party leader of the VVD. So why is the VVD quite important? Well, they have, a lot of power within the Netherlands, and they have been in power for a long time. They have got like some right-wing narratives, so they are very much a law and order party. So if you look, for example, at the campaign at some point that they did, is they had this political campaign in which they basically had a specific statement like respect for the police, and then they said very normal, and then that one was checked off, and then not normal was not checked off. And then basically they said, act normal. That was the whole idea. So the idea is just a very much law and order party, which is very strict on migration, wants to do things, the general right-wing things such as low taxes, and is both still somewhat pro the EU, but also critical of it, and still wants to have some sovereignty of, countries. The reason why they are important is because they are very powerful in the sense that they have been in every coalition since 2010. And for a very long time, they had also the prime minister. So from 2010 to 2023, they had Mark Rutte as prime minister. And as you will see also when I go through the slides, and I'm going to give you this explanation, every kind of like cabinet is then named after like Rutte first, Rutte second, Rutte third, and Rutte fourth. And it basically has been able to have coalitions, as I said, with both the left and the right. So it has had a coalition with the Labour Party of the Netherlands, but as well as something, with more right wing, like the PVV, as we currently see. So they have been willing in the past to have both coalitions and to work with different political parties. So now I'm going to explain you the first fall of the cabinet. So what basically happened, this was not this cabinet that we're talking about, but this was a different fall that happened in 2021. So basically you had a cabinet which was consisting of other right-wing and somewhat center parties. So this would be the CDA, CU, which is the Christian party, and then D66. So you see these are more center than right-wing parties. And basically you had Mark Rutte as prime minister. So the cabinet fell. And the reason for that is basically that you had a disagreement on family reunification of asylum seekers. So this was in, sorry, this was relatively easier question. So it's relatively more recent. So this was in 2023, not 2021. I'm sorry. Basically, what happened was there was asylum plan, and what Rutte and the VVD specifically wanted to do is basically not allow family reunification of asylum seekers. They basically said it is very, very big issue. You just have one asylum seeker come in, they're able to bring in their family, they're bringing more family, and this leads to a chain of like people coming in, and that's not what we want. We're basically being overflown with asylum seekers. Looking back, this claim is not true and kind of like ludicrous, but this is what the VVD was going for at the time. They also knew that the CU, so the Christian party, would be, against this because this would be against their Christian values. And also the D66, which is, again, more progressive than the VVD, was also against this. So because this goes against the asylum seeker rights that they have. The CDA could have been convinced because they are a bit closer to the VVD, but they didn't have a strict, stance on this at the time. So it fell. And basically what that meant is they could only manage ongoing policies, and basically re-elections need to happen. So if there's something very important that needs to happen, they can do that. And if there's things that need to finish off, like policy need to be changed, amendments need to be made, all of those things are fine. But they can't create new big plans, new policies that are put through. And re-election should occur relatively quickly. Now, the reasoning why VVD actually fell was if you ask the VVD, it was kind of like a genuine disagreement where they really wanted this to happen. But others say this actually has more to do with tactics. So the idea is the moment that the cabinet falls on something that's like immigration, that becomes now a hot topic. That becomes something that's interesting where the voters care about because that's now on the news, all of that kind of stuff. And this is good for the VVD because they had an anti-immigration policy and they had an anti-immigration program. So they're in the next election able to get more power and therefore will be able to push more of their plans through. So this is what other people said that the VVD were doing and why they had the cabinet fall. And as you will see, is Dutch politics is kind of like a good reality TV show. There's a lot of drama, there's a lot of intrigue, there's a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes that we don't really know, and it's really fun to kind of like see how this kind of like digs through and what the actual ideas were of people. So this gets me quickly to another party, which is the NSA. So NSA is a new social contract, and as you can see, there are two important people that are here. So you have Pieter Omtzigt, and now I'm going to completely forget the name of the current person. So I think it's Verhoeven. I forgot her specific name, but I'll get to it. Basically, NSA was a relatively new party. And before I can actually understand what the policies are, I basically need you to understand another big drama of the Netherlands and Dutch politics. So there was another fall of the cabinet, but it was basically a prequel. So it didn't happen actually in 2023, which was basically what happened before that. So it was not Rutte IV that fell, but it was Rutte III that fell. So this was roughly around 2021, 2022. So the coalition at the time was VVD, CDA, D66, and CU. So it was actually the same parties as before. And Mark Rutte was still prime minister. And another note, this is more context, like this was during Corona time. So there was already a bit more leeway towards the parties because they had to deal with quite a lot of issues. Now, there were a couple of scandals that happened. So the first thing that happened was the child benefit affair scandal. The basic problem was that the tax authorities was basically checking quite strictly against fraud of child benefits that people would get. The thing though was that they were overly strict and they basically stopped benefits to people unfairly. And this caused a lot of suffering because this meant that people got into debt, that they were unable to, for example, pay for their mortgage, that they were unable to pay for the things they need to pay for, and they had to also fight the tax because they also got told that they were frauds. They also had to pay then the tax authorities back, and it was basically also just a lot of like legal issues. And this was done quite unfairly. And this was one, and Pieter Omtzigt was one of the people who basically was pushing hard against this. So he was at the time still a party member of CDA, CDA or CDA, as we say in Dutch. Basically, this then became a very big thing. A lot happened, a lot on the news, and in the end, the government stepped down. Now, the thing is, because of the fact that, so I'll go back because it will be a bit more clear here. Because the fact that it was Corona time, it did take a bit of a time, and the government at the time did have a bit more leeway to push in policies because they did need to deal with the new variation that popped up with COVID, which was like the Delta variation. So in this case, there was a bit of ability to still deal with crisis, but still the main idea is that they do need to have new elections. Now, new elections happened, and at this point, Pieter Omtzigt was still part of CDA. What then happened is during coalition talks, so this what basically happened is that there was a formation person. The way Dutch politics works is you have different parties who want different things. So they have all the different programs. Then what happens is after the election, there will be one person who is basically, or two persons who will then try to form a coalition. They will talk to the different parties, ask what will you be willing to like give up? What do you not want to give up? All of that kind of stuff. And there's just basically one person who then is taking care of that. During the process in 2021, what happened was this picture was taken here on top. And what you saw was people were able to decipher that on this paper, it said position Omtzigt, function elsewhere, which basically meant that in the coalition talks, apparently there was talks about placing Omtzigt was quite critical and a different, on a different position, most likely trying to put them in a less powerful position so that, he wouldn't be such a pain in the ass, so to say. So what then happened is that Omtzigt split and became independent. And in the meantime, in 2021, he also wrote a book, which is A New Social Contract, which is then what he named his party after. So he didn't actually start the party immediately after he split, but basically during the elections of 2023, he created the New Social Contract. So what are the politics of NSA? So it's, as you saw, somewhere in the middle, so in the center. So it has kind of like a mix of left and right policies to advocate for. But the hard part is they don't really have a long track record. So you can't really say when they are in coalition talks or when they are in discussions, they try to focus more on either left or right wing policies. You can also see this in their program book where they say what we care about are personal responsibility, familial and communal values, and also having a fair distribution of property, which are all very different things, which can be left leaning or right leaning depending on the context. And this is just one of those things where it shows it doesn't really have a very clear stance, except for things like good governance. And on the point of immigration, it is quite conservative. It is, again, also pro-EU, but also somewhat critical in the sense of, it wants to be more transparent, all of that kind of stuff. So that's basically the NSA, and it's a relatively new party. The reason why I showed that there's this picture, there are two people, is that Omtzigt basically stepped down because he got overworked, and now we have a new person who's basically leading the party. I'll quickly look up her name in the meantime. I thought I would be able to remember it, but in the meantime, I definitely have forgotten this. Okay. So it's Vroonhoven. That's the woman who is in charge right now. Okay. So this is already showing that there is also other issues where people have with the government where they don't really have that much trust in the government as a consequence of this child benefit affair. But ironically, this hasn't really created that much distrust or disfall in the VVD because the VVD was still able to, become big after this happened. So, Rutte IV, which was again after 2021, which is after all the scandal came out, the VVD was still able to give a prime minister in the coalition, and it didn't fall off so massively that they weren't in power anymore. Now, next crisis, the BBB, or the Farmers Party. It's not the direct translation, but I think that's the best, explanation of what they basically are. And this woman is leading it, Caroline van der Plas. And the main idea here, again, is to understand first a bit of the context behind the Netherlands. So, as you might know, there's a nitrogen issue in the Netherlands, or a nitrogen crisis. And the main idea is, at some point, the EU passed a law which said that you basically cannot have a certain amount of production of nitrogen at a specific place. What this means is that you basically need to stop producing a specific amount of nitrogen before a specific time frame. So it's 2030 and 2050 when they want to have these specific goals being met. The main issue, though, is that in the Netherlands, what basically happened is that building and agricultural projects got approval not based on the nitrogen levels that they would reduce or based on the nitrogen level they would have at the time, but rather at the idea we'll solve it in the future, it will be fine, we'll reduce nitrogen in the future, and then when that's reduced, we can build these kind of projects. The main thing is that there are two kind of issues with this. It's basically that within this production, nitrogen comes free. Nitrogen comes free in two different ways. It's via ammonia. This is very harmful for plants, but because it basically means is it enriches the earth. And the way that it enriches the earth, it basically means that specific kind of plants basically come there. But that means that other kind of plants are unable to be growing in those places, which also then is bad for the insects, which is also bad for the general ecology, because you're basically changing what's happening in nature around these areas. The other one is just nitrogen oxide, which is things from buildings, from the building projects, from cars, all that kind of stuff. And those produce acid rain, which is just bad for health, but also just destroys buildings, all that kind of stuff. So these are the two ways in which nitrogen is harming nature and the Netherlands. And this is basically why these specific two substances, which both contain nitrogen, need to be stopped. The thing is, the Netherlands is the largest polluter of nitrogen within the EU. And if you look at the Netherlands, 50% of that's agriculture. So there's roughly about 30 to 30% that is actually from things that come from externally from other countries that are coming our ways when we're measuring nitrogen. Other parts are construction. Other parts are, cars driving and all that kind of stuff. But most of it is agriculture. So what this basically means is that currently there are no projects that are being, done because 80% of the 18,000 projects are basically on hold. This is things like housing projects. These are things like strengthening the dams, creating windmill parks at sea. All of these kinds of things are now not happening because we basically have too much nitrogen. The idea is because agriculture is such a large part of the reason why we have the nitrogen is to have that be limited. So if you limit that, that means that there's more nitrogen in kind of like, the nitrogen wallet that you have, and therefore you'll be able to make more of these projects. The issue though is that when you do these things, people don't really get happy. So at some point, one person in parliament, one person of a party suggested maybe halving the livestock. This was not really a real proposal that was in the government. This was something that one of the parliament members said, and then basically just created a shit ton of backlash. And other parties then campaigned against this, being like, "Oh, we'll never do this. This would be really bad," all that kind of stuff. So the other policy that then happens is trying to mitigate nitrogen for farmers in different ways. So technically, what they want could do, for example, is buying out farmers consensually. So there's also forced buying out of farmers. The thing is, though, if you look at the specific plans that the government has tried to make, and it's just the government that was before the current government, so that was the one until 2023. If you look at the transition fund, so the specific fund that they have to make sure we have less nitrogen, the buying out of farmers is never named explicitly. And I think partially it's just because of the backlash that we got from farmers. The main thing that they are focusing on is doing things like technological adaptations. So these might be, for example, trying to use ways in which nitrogen is produced less, or what they try to do is maybe have different part of agricultural lands now also become, somewhat of a nature land, therefore trying to combine these kinds of tools, and therefore trying to minimize these kinds of effects. However, the Netherlands has taken quite of a soft stance, especially with the new government, who has also given less money to this transition fund that was supposed to help, cut down the nitrogen that we have. To also give you a bit more context about what these protests were, because basically what happened is a lot of farmers were really upset the moment that this happened. You can frame this in a couple of ways. You could say that, look, a lot of the times farmers are already following a lot of rules from the EU and the Netherlands. And now it turns out that these rules were not correct. And now that you basically need to slash, a big part of their, income, of what they are known, all that kind of stuff. And basically they were just very angry and upset. You could frame this as legit, you could frame this as illegit, but basically what happened was there was a civil disobedience that happened. So they blocked, for example, highways, they burned wood in central places, they threatened politicians, and there was a lot of violence happening. Basically what they happened first, they went to provincial places. They basically threatened provincial governments, and then the governments basically said, we're not going to do anything right now. The plans that the central government gave us, we're not going to do them. We're going to change them. Some provinces actually didn't, take this back, but they got, again, more escalation. There are also, of course, a lot of normal protests and normal gatherings about this policy. But if you look at the pictures that you'll see and what people will kind of think about the farmers' protest is, they mean mostly just these kind of extreme protests that are happening. These are the ones that are in the news. This is what people think about. So basically what happened is during all of this, which was roughly 2019, the PvdA was created. This is the farmers movement. So at the first general elections, this was after Rutte and PvdA did a big no-no with the child benefit affairs. You had a new elections because the cabinet fell. This party was actually quite small, so it had only one seat. Then you had provincial elections. And in provincial elections, it was a very big win. So they won a lot there, and I think they become one of the biggest parties. However, this then also translated to then the national elections in 2023. So this was the when Margaret basically let the cabinet fall because of migration. Basically, they went from one seat to getting 16 seats. And just to give you a bit of the scope, in total in the second chamber, there are 150 seats in total. So they are, they have grown a lot. They've grown 16-fold. And basically their main standpoint is just that they are quite pro-farmers, of course. They also use this as kind of a cultural aspect, as kind of a populist standpoint, in the idea of you have the Randstad thinking, or the big city thinking, the Randstad being then the biggest cities in the Netherlands, which form a circle. This would be Rotterdam, The Hague, Amsterdam, Utrecht, all of those kinds of things. And they say, but we are, the actual people who are living outside of that. We are the normal people, the people who are the backbone of our country, all that kind of stuff. The kind of important thing here is that they're also a bit more climate skeptic. They're not outwardly skeptic, but they are more. And also, they want a bit more of the decentralization and regional power. A lot of the issues that are with the people have with the BBB is that they also tend to be a bit simplistic in some of their policies, in the sense that when they have a plan or program, they don't let that be calculated by the Central Bureau of Statistics, how much it actually costs and how much that would kind of like create. So, for example, if you do tax cuts, you get less money, but potentially the economy would grow. And then that would lead in the end to still more money to the government. There's Central Bureau statistics who can actually help with all these kinds of things to basically calculate what the plans are in the end and how much they can get in. And basically those things they don't do because the reason that they themselves give is because they feel that they don't really fully calculate the actual things that you can get out of these policies. Another kind of thing is the farmers, like the reason why nitrogen is so big and agriculture is so big in the Netherlands is the nitrogen production in the Netherlands is big is because the agriculture sector in the Netherlands is really, really big. In a sense, it's the second largest exporter of agricultural products after the US. So it's a really big exporter. It isn't necessarily a big part of the Dutch GDP, but it is like, when you look at, other countries, if you ask yourself why in the EU aren't maybe these kind of things happening, as well as because they are less big exporters of, for example, meat, of agricultural products, of these kinds of things. This was the BBB. Now we're going to get more spicy. We're going to talk about the PVV. So PVV is basically being led by Geert Wilders. And as you can see, they are somewhat in the middle and they are quite conservative, more conservative than VVD, but maybe more progressive than some of the other parties that we also have. So what is basically the PVV origin? So also the PVV actually started as a split of a different party. So Geert Wilders was originally part of the VVD, the big political party that we talked about in the beginning, and he was kind of like a hardliner on migration. Then at some point he spoke out very, very harshly against Turkish EU membership. And basically the VVD was like, hey, take that back. And then Geert Wilders was like, nope. And then basically he got expelled in 2004. He was in the parliament or in the chamber as like an own person. And then he started his own, well, I'm saying here it's a party, but technically it's not a party, in 2006. 2006. What is quite unique is this is no traditional party because it has no traditional party members. So this kind of like means that this basically one organization, and that's basically just Geert Wilders. And there are other people you can vote on, but there aren't any membership. So there isn't anyone who, for example, selects the program. There isn't anyone who can hold Geert Wilders accountable because they're all part of, the one company or the one organization that's basically Geert Wilders. This also means actually that they don't get government funding. So in the Netherlands, you can get government funding for political campaigns, but it only is there if you are a democratic party, which means that you have members who can vote on policy. And, if you have some of this membership, but there's no membership of the PVV in this sense. So what's then the politics of the PVV? It is quite anti-Islam and immigration. So he is well known within the Netherlands for at some point making a statement when he was talking to a group of people, when he was giving a speech where saying, do we want more or less Moroccans? And then everyone outside said, less, less, less. And then in the end, there was a very big trial that was around this, where it was like, is this racist? Is it inflammatory? Is it something a political party and political person can say within the Netherlands? And this took a very long while. In the end, basically was the conclusion that yes, what he did was discriminatory, but because he's a political figure, he basically has more leeway to be able to say this. Afterwards, as well, he basically said that I wasn't actually talking about Moroccans in general, but just the kind of Moroccans who are, doing harm to the Netherlands by being criminals and that kind of stuff. They are, in general, quite anti-Islam, so they have strong opinions, like, for example, banning the Quran. They want closed borders. They want to have a lot of things which are just quite extreme in that sense. If you look at their left and right-wing policy, it's kind of like populist. So what they want to do is, for example, they don't want to do budget cuts to things like healthcare or the police or something like that, but they also want things like low taxes. And this makes them both kind of like flexible, but also economically not maybe that sound. They're also quite populist, so they have the same kind of like rhetoric where they're saying, we're against the elite, we're against the left elite, all of that kind of stuff, and basically is overall a quite, maybe stereotypical right-wing populist kind of person. One kind of fun fact that I want to note is at some point they had a party program which was just on 1 page or 2 pages, which were just 10 points where they stood for, which is, more money to healthcare, stricter immigration, all of that kind of stuff. Which is quite interesting from a political science standpoint, because on the one hand, it is very much a stripped down idea of what a party program would be and how things could help, but also is one of those things where it shows it's just about simple ideas that are able to speak to people because they are able to just fit on 2 pages. Now, again, the thing happened. It's time again to explain how the cabinet fell, and we need to vote again. So I'm going to explain how this happened this time. So we now have the sequel. So we had the one in 2023, which was because Rutte thought it would be good to get more votes because of immigration. We had the prequel because we had basically bad policy by the cabinet that happened, and there wasn't accountability. And now basically the PVV is trying to do the same thing as Rutte tried to do. So you have a coalition, and the current coalition, so it's more right wing, so it's the VVD, PVV, Farmers Movement, and New Sociaal Contract, NSC. And this is a technocratic government. What this means is you have Dick Schoof as prime minister. So Dick Schoof is a person who was not aligned to a specific political party. But basically the issue was you have all these coalition talks. The VVD didn't want to start anything with the left-wing parties. So they were like, okay, we kind of like need to start talking with these other right-wing parties, maybe even some center parties. But they were unable to form a majority. They didn't want to have the PVV coalition where the PVV, which was at the time the biggest party, to give a prime minister. So basically what happened is you had a lot of concessions that were being made where the PVV said, fine, we'll form a coalition. Geert Wilders will not be prime minister. We'll elect someone externally, which would be then Dick Schoof, who was not assigned to any specific political party, but rather was had a couple of functions in his career. But one of the big ones was he was a Secretary General of the Ministry of Justice and Safety. So this is actually good and practical for a lot of things because the VVD is able to now form a coalition with the PVV, for the PVV getting power. But also the PVV, Geert Wilders, can basically complain every single time something goes wrong by saying, it's a Dick Schoof's fault. We're basically not being heard, all of that kind of stuff. Now, another thing that happened within this concession talks is that within the PVV, the Minister of Asylum and Migration, Marjolein Faber, was basically selecting. So she's from the PVV. That was one of the things that they got. Now, what are the official reasons for the parliament falling? What basically happened was that PVV came out with a long list on extra things that they wanted to do about asylum. So these were things like actually closing the borders, all these kinds of things. There were the 10 points, which were quite extreme. And if you look at it, quite practically could not have been done. Afterwards, basically what happened is then PVV said, look, we are unable to get this through, and therefore this basically stepped out. What is kind of interesting is the tactics that other parties have taken, so the NSC, BB, and VVD, where that at times when you had these discussions would say, no, all those policies, we were fine with putting them in. We said we would be able to do that. That wasn't an issue. So they're trying to make it seem that it was basically the PVV that stepped out for that specific reason. To get, again, some benefits out of it rather than actually the reasons being that they were unable to get the list. What is then the context that kind of like gives credence to this idea that this was most likely, again, a tactical idea that the PVV used is a lot of the policies that the PVV tried to do weren't actually succeeding. So every single policy that Faber actually tried to implement really work. The only thing that she was able to basically get in was controlling the borders inside of the Netherlands and then trying to find asylum seekers. But because they're already in the Schengen zone, this would basically be ineffective and nothing was found. And basically, ineffective policy, nothing else really got passed. And this wasn't really good. And also there was a policy that they proposed, which is basically going to freeze the rent. And basically it was not well written. Basically a body of the Dutch government, I don't know a specific one, I don't know how to translate it in English, was basically saying it's not well written. We are advising against you placing this policy because it's just not well written. It wouldn't be a good law, all that kind of stuff. And basically what happened then was Geert Wilders just stepped out because it was just going to be failing. And now they're able to basically say the reason why it fell was not because we were incompetent in running the government, but rather it is because we weren't being heard, our policies weren't able to be passed through, and we were standing up for true Dutch values that are protecting our country and are against immigration. A kind of like fun context as well is that a couple of the PVV members also did not know that Geert Wilders was going to do this. So if you look at them, what they said before, the cabinet fell, they seem to be quite positive this is going to happen. Dick Schoof was also saying that most likely they will be able to resolve these issues, all of that kind of stuff. So it is also like very clear again that it was specifically that the PVV is practically just Geert Wilders, and Geert Wilders is making this decision. And as a PVV member, you're not as much in the loop. There isn't as much control that you have. And basically what happens is what Geert Wilders wants to happen. Okay, let's see. I have a bit of time. So what I can do is I can basically now explain the prequel to the prequel, because it wouldn't be the first time that a cabinet fell. This also happened because of the PVV earlier. What basically happened is in 2012, was a coalition. It was again, the VVD was in power. This was Rutte, again being the prime minister, who was having a minority cabinet with the CDA. And basically what happened was they needed another party to get the policy through, because otherwise they wouldn't have a numerical majority. What basically happened was that the PVV wouldn't be actual part of the coalition, but rather would, like in Dutch, we would say gedogen, which would be directly translated to tolerating the coalition, which basically means that if the VVD and CDA want to have anything passed, the PVV basically needs to be voting on it as well. Basically, there were new economic cuts that needed to happen, and what basically happened is that the PVV again didn't want to support the policy, and then just stepped out and then said, okay, we're not going to support these budget cuts. So the government was unable to implement them, and basically they were unable to push a policy. Again, it was Geert Wilders specifically who made this decision in these talks, stepped outside and just decided, like, I'm not going to do this anymore. The context of this is, as you can see, this is 2012, and if you remember correctly, PVV started around 2006. This is the first time they were in coalition. So they have been a big party before, but they've always been in opposition. And the first time that they basically in a coalition, or somewhat in a coalition, or they're related to a coalition, they basically stepped out, let it fall. And what basically happened is that the VVD was very angry at the PVV and afterwards said, we're never going to work for you again, or we're not going to work for you again in the next election cycle, and that kind of stuff. And people got kind of like, politicians got quite upset at, Geert Wilders and PVV for basically letting the government fall in such a hard time. So now PVV has basically done it twice, getting as close as the amount of times the VVD have done it in the past. Now, this is all very right wing, and of course, it would not be balanced if I would only keep talking about the right wing. So now I'm going to talk about the left wing of the Netherlands, specifically this party, or actually there are two parties. This is Frans Timmermans, which is currently the person who is the top of, like, it's kind of like leading this cooperation, I would say. And this is Jesse Klaver, which is the person who is basically the leader of GroenLinks. What do I mean with this? So GroenLinks and PvdA are basically two different parties, but they're not two different parties, but they are. What do I mean with this? So you have the PvdA, which is just party of the laborers, which just means in English, I will translate as the Labour Party. And you have GroenLinks, which is just the green left. Basically what they have right now, this happens for this specific elections. This was in 2023. They have a shared list of candidates with a shared fraction within the parliament, so in the first and second chamber, and they have one party program. So this is practically just two parties sharing and coming together, but they're still their separate organizations. So they have their own members and they have their own congresses, and they also have a different way in which they deal with issues. So, for example, GroenLinks is a more directly democratic party in the sense that members have way more direct control over the party program and who's on the candidate list, whereas the Labour Party has more committees and has more people who are on top and are basically have more sway in some context about what the policy is going to be or who's going to be selected. They're still, of course, voting within the Labour Party, but it is less directly democratic as GroenLinks. So the reason why they basically came together is if we come together, and we're very closely linked politically anyways, we can come together, we can basically make the left so big that the right won't be able to form a coalition without us. That was the idea, because what basically happened is Labour, before the kind of like cooperation, had 9 seats, and GroenLinks had 8 seats, which again would be roughly like 17 seats, which isn't that much in parliament when you have 150 of total seats. The Labour Party mainly focuses on like left-wing politics, so it focuses on workers, labor rights, all the kind of stuff, and it's more about some more small changes. And the main thing is they were quite big for a long time, especially historically. But after the coalition that they had with the VVD in 2012, 2017, which was again one of the coalitions where the right actually worked with the left, they basically fell down from 38 seats they had before or like during this coalition to afterwards 9 seats. And the reason was just basically VVD was basically dominating the coalition talks in the sense that a lot of policies that happened were quite right wing, and a lot of things had to be cut. A lot of things that the Labour Party normally stood for were basically not really what's it called? Weren't really stood for. And as a consequence of that, what basically happens was that the Labour Party just basically fell off. It wasn't trustworthy. The people didn't trust it that it would be able to represent their ideas anymore. Um, the Green Left, as a political party, is more on ecological politics. So it therefore focuses more on this kind of side, the green side, and is a bit more radical in its changes. So it's not like an actual communist socialist kind of party, but it is willing to take stronger steps that change the status quo compared to maybe Labour Party was a bit more about the smaller changes. The important thing is that they've never been in a coalition before. They were somewhat bigger after Labour fell off, but before they merged together, they were again back at 8 seats. So because of this, because there's quite a lot of overlap on just, they both care about, doing government things, having a lot of government subsidies for things like healthcare, for things like education, for helping people with homes, and also both have things they care about when it comes to, green policies and making sure that climate change doesn't get too bad. They basically started together and tried to, form this group together to basically fight against the VVD. This was actually quite successful because the Labour Party did in the election become the second largest party after the PVV. And I think this is one of the reasons why the VVD was unwilling to maybe form a coalition with Green Left and Labour Party, is because they would be the bigger party, which would mean that instead of it being like Rutte II, it would now be Timmermans 1, and then maybe the VVD would be screwed over and they would lose their voters as well, wouldn't be able to push in as many anti-migration policies as they wanted to go for. So therefore, you have the Green Left and the Labour Party coming together. Now, as you have seen, there were a lot of different parties that were also on this axis that I haven't talked about. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to talk about every single one of them, but I am going to talk about just a couple of them and how they work. So you will have debates about whether it's overall good to have these small parties and whether it is something that is maybe we should get rid of, or whether we should put legislation that makes it harder for parties to kind of like have party members split off. And oftentimes people just say small parties don't really have that much power. And in some sense, this is true, and in some sense, this is not true. So, for example, when technically you are a small party, every single person can propose legislation. However, this is seldomly voted in. Sometimes it's voted in to kind of like appease the opposition, or whether it's a genuine good plan, or when there is, a small coalition, like a coalition is quite small numerically, and therefore they might want to appease people who are somewhat closer to them, and therefore have more people kind of like, tolerate the coalition, if that makes sense. What they are more likely to do is just adapting and amending policies. And I'll go through a couple of the small parties and what they do to explain how this could work. But one of the things that you could think about is when you have COVID guidelines, people focus a lot on like making sure they're true, making sure that they are clear. But then sometimes specific groups like migrants or people who don't speak Dutch that clearly are not thought about. And then a party can be like, look, we need also to make sure that the COVID guidelines are in like super simple Dutch so that also these people can understand it. What they can also do is they can hold cabinet members accountable. And this is important, right? So one of the things I talked about was the child benefit affairs. And it's one of those things where basically there are opposition parties and other parties who are able to call out these problems. Another issue that we had in the Netherlands was basically a gas issue where basically we're having Groningen is a province in the north of the Netherlands. That province has gas. Gas is kind of nice because we can use it for industry and warming our houses and all that kind of stuff. However, when you make that gas and you get it out of the ground, sometimes what you'll do is you will, by the way the extraction process work, it will cause the earth to kind of like shake. And as a consequence of that, houses get destroyed, and therefore also these houses should get benefits. Also, this kind of benefits weren't really done well by the government. And there were other parties, like the Socialist Party, the SP, who normally isn't that big, were able to call out these issues. They are talking about, hey, show us documentation. Hey, I want to have a discussion about this policy. I want to have these people be heard, and all of those kinds of things. And when you do this enough, this gets into the news and these problems get talked about. And then you are able to hold cabinet members accountable for the policies they have been able, to through, the things that aren't executed correctly, all that kind of stuff. Also, important thing is coalitions are important for example, small parties are important for coalitions. So, as I talked about in previous coalitions, the CU, so the ChristenUnie, is part of the coalition, but oftentimes they wouldn't have actually that many seats. This shows that they do have power because, again, they were able to have a reason why the cabinet fell. Right, the cabinet fell because partially the Christian party, the CU, said, well, we don't want to have these asylum rights taken away because we think it's against the Christian values. So again, there's other ways in which this can happen, especially when there are many parties. It's just you need one of the small parties is quite big, and therefore it is good to actually have these votes represented within the parliament. Now, what are then one of the parts I was going to talk about? One of them is actually DENK. So DENK is kind of like an anti-discrimination party, which specifically focuses on immigrants and Muslims, and is kind of like maybe somewhat of a polar opposite of the PVV in the sense that they are coming up for these people and they are basically criticizing, oftentimes specifically the PVV, and just going and saying good things for these groups. However, this is not without controversy. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because small parties can be good, small parties can be bad. But one of the things that happens with small parties is they need to grab attention to become big and to be able to get seats. And one of the ways that they were doing that is by having controversial, campaigning with videos that they made. So they would be sometimes it would be just like, oh, they are doing fake news or they are doing all of these kinds of things and just, do the kind of like clickbait, left wing gets destroyed by Ben Shapiro kind of things, but now from DENK side. And some of this is, fine. But some of the things that they also did was they would attack other politicians. So this would be, for example, from Labour Party or from the Green Left Party, who had, for example, Turkish background. They would attack them and place them in such a way, calling them hypocrites, all that kind of stuff, which then also led to them getting a lot of hate mail and getting a lot of attack online, social media, all this kind of stuff. And sometimes they were also not even people who were in the chamber. So you can be part of the party, so you can work for the party, but not actually be a representative who sits in the first or second chamber. And those people would also be attacked. And basically, if you ask them afterwards, like why they did this, is it just because they needed to get people motivated to vote for them because they are a small party and they need to grab attention. And sometimes it's the only way for them to do grab attention. So this is kind of like the two sides of the coin, that people do also do these kind of extreme things to get attention, and they do also have clear effects. And there are other problems with DENK. There are potential issues with the way that they see Turkey and the relationship that they want to have with Turkey. The specific things where they are quite populist and they are partaking in identity politics the same way the PVV does, which is also harmful, and that kind of stuff. So it is also like I think an interesting party because it shows that there are different ways in which populism can happen, which can have both positive and negative effects, even though it's the same party. What is then other parties that are here? I think two other parties are still interesting to talk about. So the first one is Party for the Animals. So this one has 3 seats, just like DENK, and this is just an animal welfare party. And what they're able to do is, even though they haven't been part of coalition, and if you remember, there hasn't been really a left-wing coalition for a very long time, but they're able to kind of like push for stronger regulations. So they're a very good example of what I think of what a party can do, even if they aren't in power, to still get change. So, for example, they make a lot of noise about the usage of specific labels. So if you have, for example, cruelty-free, or if it says that this is a specific kind of eggs that are laid by specific kind of chickens who have a specific amount of like square feet of land, then that needs to be clear that these are indeed things that are accessible for a long time, that they are truly cruelty-free things and products that are being made. But because they were basically making such a ruckus about this, governments were basically willing to make amendments and to create policy which is a bit stricter. And also they were basically trying to create stricter regulations on farmers. So sometimes there is already existing regulation, but sometimes the execution of that isn't done perfectly, or sometimes there's a vagueness of the interpretation of the law. And basically these parties are saying like, look, here are all these issues, here's the way we should do this, here's how we want to amend this policy to make it actually clearer, all of that kind of stuff. So they are able to make changes, even though they have never been part of a coalition. Another party, which I thought was interesting, is a very conservative party. So again, maybe to kind of like show where they are, Denk was somewhat more left-leaning and so progressive. The Party for the Animals is quite left-leaning and progressive. And the SGP that we're going to talk about is quite conservative. And I would maybe even place them a bit more conservative down here. But basically what happens is they are very conservative Christian values. They're somewhat more right-wing. So they want things like, low taxes, not that much government influence, but they go hard on specifically the Christian values. And this is oftentimes the more centralized around one specific idea parties. So they're not one issue politics, one issue or one topic. Not one issue politics, but I would say maybe they have their identity based on one specific general norm or trend. And here it's specifically Christian values. And this means that, for example, they're quite critical of things like abortion, euthanasia, and homosexuality. But what also is very interesting here is that they actually didn't allow women in their political party, so either as a member or as to run, until 2006. And there has been a lot of criticism against them because there is, again, there are no women basically in the party, in the higher ups of the parties. So technically it is allowed, but it is very weird that there aren't any women. And basically they are standing strong on those more classic roles of, conservative ideas. And the reason why they aren't really adapting is they don't really need to, because the SGP is just constantly getting every election 3 seats. It never goes up much, it never goes down much. And because it is always constant and they just have a specific group of people that they are catering to, they are unwilling to change. And there is no need to change. So I think here again, it shows also the other side of political parties, which is that sometimes if you just have a specific group that you could go for, you just don't need to change and don't need to adapt, which can also means that you become less representative. And also means that you're unwilling to maybe form coalitions and maybe to try to create policies that is good for maybe the general policy, because you just have those 3 votes who will always vote for you, but only when you do these kind of like extreme things that you stand for. Okay, that is it for now, because I think this was basically 6 already. I did a lot of yapping, but I hope that it was clear what all of this means. I hope that you understand that political parties in the Netherlands need to form coalitions. Coalitions fall apart for various reasons. There are various issues in those, from the nitrogen crisis to the child benefit affairs, all these kinds of things which lead to a lack of distrust in the government. But also there's a variety of tactics that are taking place by both big and small parties that just follow from the mere fact that they are just in a very much multi-party system in which you need to form coalitions, or you're very stable in the people that you get. And there are other things that I haven't discussed. So, for example, the housing crisis, it is directly and indirectly linked to the fact that we can't build any houses, but also, of course, other issues. Things become more expensive, houses standing empty because people speculate on them. All that kind of stuff is a complex issue which requires a lot more analysis than I can do right now. There's a shortage of places in prison. We have a lot of cuts in education and healthcare. There's also a divide on, what the stand should be on Israel-Palestine. And there are a lot of other issues, but I think the most important, the core issues, which are able to be explained in, again, roughly 1 hour, are in this workshop. Are there any questions about either any other political party I have mentioned? I haven't mentioned what other potential issues may be. Please let me know. Please do let me know also verbally, because I cannot see the chat.
All right, I'm just going to unmute to pass around the mic. Does anyone have any questions? Seeing none. Anyone online having questions? Yeah, I think not. That's great. Then everyone understood everything. Can we have a big round of applause for Pjotr? Yeah, thanks a lot, Pjotr, for the workshop. It was really good, and it's also really useful for us, mainly because like the Dutch Euros is next year. So hopefully you guys are going to be doing the Euros next year too. And then this is going to come in really, really handy. Also maybe for Discom, I don't know. Pjotr probably knows. Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. One last thing, Pjotr isn't here right now, but we do have gifts for you. But I'll just give it to you when you're crashing at my house. But yeah, but that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll have a short 5-minute break and then start with the next workshop. Yeah, but if you guys can have snacks, everything's there. Go grab snacks.
Shouldn't we stop and pause the recording for just a second so people who do not want to be recorded can ask questions?
Sorry, Pjotr, I was outside of the room. I'm really sorry, yeah. Can you say again?
So my question was, should we not stop the recording right now and then let people ask questions that don't want to be on the recording?
Right, sorry, I forgot about that part. Yeah, I'm gonna stop the recording.